Hello, and thank you for coming. My name is Robert Hollahan. I'm an assistant professor here at Binghamton University in the Environmental Studies program in political science. I want to welcome you to our debate today on the topic of hydraulic fracturing. The debate is sponsored by the Political Science Department and the Environmental Studies program in conjunction with a local nonprofit here in Binghamton called You Defend It, the purpose of which is to bring debates, real political debates, on timely topics to the public. So I don't want to take up too much time in introductions, but I'd like to introduce both of our debaters today. To my right, we have John Holko, who is President of Lenape Resources and a board member of the New York State Oil and Gas Association, the Independent Oil and Gas Association of New York. Mr. Holko is a petroleum engineer with a degree from Penn State. He's been active in the oil and gas industry for several decades and currently works, as I mentioned, as the President of Lenape Resources. To my left is Sandra Steingraber. Ms. Steingraber is a PhD in biology from from the University of Michigan. She's currently a distinguished visiting scholar in the Division of Interdisciplinary and International Studies at Ithaca College, and is a prominent writer on the topic of ecological writings. Rob Kilmer will be the moderator today, and so I will hand it off to him. Thank you.
Thank you, good evening, and welcome to this You Defend It debate. As you heard, it is being co-sponsored by the Political Science Department and Environmental Studies program at Binghamton University, and Defend It, Inc., which is the owner of the You Defend It debate tour. My name is Rob Kilmer, and I will be moderating the debate. You Defend It debates are different than other debates in purpose and format. The purpose is to take important issues, divisive issues, and break them down. Emotional arguments have no place here. The assertions of the debaters will be tested by requiring debaters to fully defend their own positions rather than attacking their opponents. The public will get a clear picture of what each side can actually prove. The format is simple. There are two rules governing content. Number one, each debater must answer the question directly. And number two, each must do so without reference to the opposing debater or the opposing debater's positions. In other words, each must put forth his or her own positions and defend them. Because the debaters' positions are so different, they will rarely be asked to respond to the same questions tonight. Instead, the questions will be designed to evaluate their different arguments. The debaters will have 3 minutes to respond to the initial question, and then I will ask as many follow-up questions as I think are necessary to provide exact information to the audience. Tonight's issue is hydraulic fracturing in New York. New York has been operating under a de facto moratorium on fracking since 2008. As it stands now, Governor Cuomo is supposed to make a decision sometime in 2015. Those who support hydrofracking in New York believe it will return prosperity to a region that is desperate for it. Thousands of families have raised children here in the last 30 years, only to watch them move away for better opportunity. That hurts. Those who oppose hydrofracking believe that any economic benefit it may provide is far outweighed by the danger it represents. Unfortunately, those same families who have suffered through the departures of their loved ones also live with the aftermath of our most storied employer, IBM, having spilled over 4,000 gallons of methylchloroform, creating a plume in Endicott in the town of Union, affecting nearly 500 structures. Out of respect for and in deference to the people who live in this community and have such a stake in the outcome, the audience will be asked to remain quiet throughout. As difficult as that may be, we owe it to ourselves for one night to conduct a debate that is accountable yet civil. For my part, I promise to moderate a debate worthy of the issue being discussed and worthy of the people whose lives are going to be affected by the outcome. With that said, let's get on with it. By coin toss before the debate, it was determined that the first question will go to Sandra Steingraber. Ms. Steingraber, in Colorado, the governor, environmentalists, and the energy industry were able to pound out rules for hydrofracking that they could all live with. Why can't we do that in New York?
Thanks, Rob. Well, I would say that they're not living with it very well. In fact, 4 different towns in Colorado have declared bans on fracking precisely because the regulatory approach to fracking can't make fracking safe. And so the people of Colorado are beginning to follow New York's example. And New York was fortunate in that our preceding governor put in place a moratorium on fracking, which allowed it several years ago, which allowed us then to have the time to evaluate the risks both to the environment and to our health. And so we've been engaged in that process ever since. Other states were gripped by a kind of gold rush mentality and rolled out fracking very rapidly.
With respect to Colorado in particular, 4 towns out of how many hundreds of towns in Colorado have objected to this. My point is this: is there no way in New York that the industry, that people who oppose fracking right now, and that the government can they not work out a set of rules they can all live with? Has it been attempted?
No. The data indicate that fracking is not safe, and there's no evidence to exist that says that it can be made safe through regulations or through best practices. And I think that's what we're focused on here in New York, the idea that there are many risks inherently unmanageable and that no regulations would be able to make us feel safe. And many of the harms so created are inherent to the system and they're unfixable. So as an example, here on the Marcellus Shale, our shale is quite radioactive, and when we blow it apart to get the methane out, so too comes radon and radium out with the wastewater, as well as native gases. There are many other things trapped down in the shale in addition to the methane that we're after, things like benzene, formaldehyde, and so forth. And there is no solution to containing those things so that we're not all exposed to that. Similarly, with disposal of fracking waste, we don't have a good solution for what to do with it. There are no really good choices. There's no best practice. You can use the poisonous radioactive frack water that flows back out of the hole as a de-icer and spread it on the road. But in a dairy state like New York, where we have many cows on the road, many cows in pastures, the radioactivity can easily get inside the milk, and that is a great concern to us. And when we shove the wastewater back into the ground, we know it's linked definitively now to earthquakes. And so there really is no good solution. So rather than take a regulatory approach in New York, we have simply hit the pause button here, recognizing that there is no right way to do something that you shouldn't be doing in the first place.
Mr. Holko, the next question's for you. Assuming that New York were to approve hydrofracking, I want to talk about the economic benefit to New Yorkers. And the first thing I want to nail down with you is jobs. How many New Yorkers does the industry estimate will be hired directly by the energy companies, and for what jobs?
There's, Rob, there's various numbers of employment, but it all depends on one thing, and that is the buildup of the industry in the state. As you've seen in Pennsylvania, the numbers are in the thousands directly employed, 10, 20, 30,000 people, if not more. Indirectly, there's additional numbers that multiply that. What's happened to New York is the likelihood initially is probably smaller numbers as the development grows. But the key is it's employment, and one is better than none, and 100 is better than 1, and 1,000 is better than 100. So the opportunity we've developed, like looking at Pennsylvania as an example, is we can grow this industry into thousands of employees. And that's directly related to the operation, from land work, through drilling, through pipeline, through production, into maintenance of compressors and pipelines and ongoing operations.
Well, in the first, say, 5 years, you're talking primarily development, correct?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that that would be when the largest number of New Yorkers are hired, is in the development and construction phase of wells and facilities associated with the wells?
It's when the majority of the people are hired with direct work on the well sites or the pipelines.
And these are people hired locally, or are these people who come in from out of state to do the construction and development?
Well, I think part of what's happened because of the lapse in time in New York is we've had a lot of the ancillary industries develop just across the border. It's as easy to come into New York from Scranton as it is to come into Binghamton from Buffalo. So you'll have some of those people come in, where you hear people talking about license plates from Texas. A lot of that is because we just didn't have the personnel and the engineers and the other people in New York. But that's coming here. You have people in New York that are going to Pennsylvania to learn the energy industry, and they'll be available for those jobs.
But apart from learning the energy industry, learning how what seems like some more higher tech jobs, as far as blue-collar laborers, is there a number you can put on the number of people that the energy industry anticipates hiring out of the pool of New York workers in the first 5 years?
I'd say that what you'd have is, if you look at the labor pools that are working for the unions going across the border, which are in the range of a couple thousand, you would have that employment level staying in New York.
Working directly for energy companies?
Yes.
Okay. Next question is for Sandra Steingraber. Compared to coal, burning natural gas produces about half the carbon dioxide. Is it fair to say that the primary issues that you have with hydrofracking are not so much with the natural gas or the burning of it, but with the process of extracting it from the ground?
Well, they're both problematic, and I would say equally so. And so there are two problems associated with fracking, if we want to put them all in two general categories. One is that the process of extracting the gas and get it out of the ground requires deliberately poisoning our drinking water supply to turn it into a toxic club to shatter the bedrock. And that necessarily, along with that, come immense amount of air pollution, both in the form of diesel exhaust and then benzene, formaldehyde, toluene, all these gases that are emitted as soon as the drill hits the shale. And in addition, then, not only is there a threat to water, to air contamination, but also to our water in several ways. And one of those is because of the well casings themselves. 5% of well casings fail immediately according to the operator's own data, according to information coming out of Pennsylvania. 6 to 7% of wells are compromised, according to the DEP, and that number increases over time. All it takes is one failed well to contaminate an aquifer forever, and then there's no way to clean it up. So we're creating a pipeline, if you will, of unstoppable consequences. And so that's the toxic problem. In addition to that comes after you've extracted the gas, put it in a pipeline and taken it to the point of combustion, and now you're lighting it on fire. At this point now, you are creating CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, as we know. And indeed, you're creating half the amount that you would if you had burned coal. But all along the pipeline, methane itself, unburned methane, is emitted because it leaks as fugitive emissions. And so this added to the CO2 that's produced at the point of combustion creates a greenhouse gas footprint that is far exceeds just the amount that you get with CO2. And so the environmental agencies, both here in the United States and in Europe, are quite clear that burning natural gas cannot save us from climate catastrophe. It's not better enough than coal that it is a solution to climate change. Only renewables can do that.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there evidence of large-scale contamination in Pennsylvania right now?
There is.
Why have they not stopped it then? No, these are important questions.
Well, I think there are a couple factors at play, and one of them surely is the non-disclosure agreements that are the kind of modus operandi of the industry in Pennsylvania, and this was something noted by Bloomberg News itself. In other words, the leases that are signed with the landowners compel landowners, if something goes wrong, in order to get, for example, replacement water, to say nothing to anyone ever. And so this has really impeded the ability of those of us in the public health community to go down and do really good science, because there are people who are legally bound not to speak about it. And there are other forms of silence too, which have made it hard to get this story out. But let me put a finer point on what that story is. So we now know that that there are confirmed cases of water contamination in 4 different states, of which Pennsylvania is one. That was a big investigation done by the Associated Press. In Pennsylvania, we know from another study out of the Scranton Times-Tribune, there are 161 cases of water contamination. So how could this be? How could they all pile up without a kind of hue and cry earlier on? So the non-disclosure agreements are part of the problem, but another part of the problem are the exemptions that the industry itself enjoys from some of our major federal laws. And so, for example, all other industries must report releases of inherently toxic chemicals under the Toxics Release Inventory. That's part of our law, EPGRA, the Environmental Planning and Community Right to Know, but not fracking. Fracking has an exemption from that provision of the law, so allowing them to keep as trade secrets the kind of chemicals they're using. So
right,
that makes it difficult to know the chemicals that we're using. It makes it difficult for people to tell their own stories. That being said, in spite of this enforced silence now, the data are beginning to emerge.
Next question, John Holko. Do you dispute that methane escapes at some point during the process of either constructing the wells or operating the wells, or when the wells are idle?
No.
You agree with that? That at some point methane escapes?
Yeah, I mean, methane escapes when you drill water wells.
Okay.
So,
Now,
I mean, methane, it's basically a natural material in the earth. Most of the sediments in our environment contain biodegradable material that turns into methane.
but you acknowledge that methane escapes during the hydrofracking process, whether it's drilling the wells, or whether it's when the well's in use, or whether it's when the well is idle. And I've watched, preparing to do this debate, I've watched a number of different debates and comments where the industry seems to take the position that, yes, there is methane escaping, but we're getting better at it with each passing day. Is that a fair statement of where the industry is?
The best practices model that the industry is operating under now is to basically collect all methane, regardless of source. So whether it's during the drilling phase or during the completion operation, during the flowback, the attitude is there's only one way to handle it: either collect it and sell it, or burn it.
Isn't it fair, though, at this point, for New Yorkers to say, until you have perfected the process of capturing all the methane that is released by drilling, that it shouldn't happen in New York?
And in my opinion, it's not fair, because there is nothing we do, whether it's farming or taking the garbage to the dump, that doesn't create methane. When we go to the bathroom, we have methane. So when we talk about methane as an issue, yes, I mean, we have to watch it, we have to control it. In our environment, methane is the product we sell. So what we do is, our charge is to basically collect it and sell it. That's the revenue stream we generated. Is it fair to say don't do anything until you can absolutely do it without any sort of hazard? And the answer to that is we could never do anything.
But methane being exponentially more hazardous to the atmosphere than natural gas, than coal, isn't it reasonable for New Yorkers to say, until you have solve that problem, we shouldn't have it here in New York.
No, the release of methane, basically the automatic release of methane during hydrocarbon development is less than during agriculture, is less than during biofuel development. So what we have is we have an industry that focuses on the capturing of methane. So our focus is that. So if you want an industry out there to work with taking care of a methane issue, if there is one, and you have to understand that some of the reports done on the viability of whether methane is as bad as it is have been refuted by all kinds of reputable people. I'm not going to get into that argument here. Let's assume that the best thing is the industry that best handles methane is our industry that takes it, develops it, and sells it. So what you want is you want the technology and advancements coming out of an industry that knows how to handle it.
Well, let me ask you this. 10 days ago, the journal Science published a study conducted by scientists at Stanford, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the United States Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory that concluded there's already 50% more methane in the atmosphere than previously estimated by the EPA, and that even switching from diesel fuel to natural gas in trucks is not good policy from a climate perspective because the methane emissions that occur during hydrofracking negate the benefit of burning natural gas as a fuel. Do you have a scientific basis to disagree with that study?
There is a bunch of scientific basis because the likelihood of the greenhouse gas emissions and the long-term impact is more impacted by CO2 than methane. And there still is a lot of refutal and misunderstanding of what impact methane has.
Would it be fair to wait till it's clear?
No.
I mean, we're not talking about losing,
Well,
losing wheat out of off the back of the truck that costs the industry money.
Rob,
we're talking about something that's possibly
Rob, let me ask you,
damaging to the atmosphere and possibly contaminating water. Isn't it reasonable to say, if there's confusion, considering the gravity of what we're talking about here, let's wait till it's resolved?
The largest producer of methane in Livingston County, which I operate a lot of wells in, is dairy farming.
But there's no hydrofracking in that county now.
Well, yeah, I can hydrofrack in that county.
Not high volume.
Not high volume. But I can still hydrofrack. And there are landfills releasing methane. And there are dairy farms releasing methane. And if we were to shut down, if you wanted to isolate industries, like I said, the industry to isolate for methane would be the biological disposition of methane, whether it's landfills or whether it's farming, because there's a lot more of that in New York, and there's no moratorium on those. So why would you have a moratorium on something that's going to develop the handling of methane and not work on somebody that can?
How long has high-volume hydrofracking been in existence?
We started in the mid to late 70s. It was called massive hydraulic fracturing. Okay? It's essentially about the equivalent volume per stage that we do today.
Then 40 years?
Yeah.
Isn't that enough time for somebody to have gotten this problem under control of capturing all the methane?
But part of your question was not just the hydrofracking stage. There's no methane released during the hydrofracking stage. The misconception is when people refer to the terminology fracking and hydrofracking, they want to include the drilling, the setting of the cements, the completion of the well, the production of the well, the completion of the pipeline. If you're talking about hydrofracking, the release of methane during hydrofracking is none. We're pumping fluid into the ground. The hydrostatic pressure of the water holds methane down, so there is no release of methane during hydrofracking.
But you at least acknowledge that when you drill the holes themselves, methane is released.
I have a water well in my front yard.
I got to move to the next question here. I just want to know if you acknowledge that.
Yeah.
The next question, Sandra Steingraber. There is no guarantee that natural gas drilled in New York would be sold in New York, at least not all of it. What, if any, environmental impact is there from liquefying gas for transport out of New York to other markets?
Well, that's right. As soon as the methane comes out of the ground, it's now a global commodity and can be given a passport to be sold in other nations where it can fetch a much higher price. The way to send natural gas across the ocean is to turn it into liquefied natural gas. And that's done through a cryogenic process, meaning that we're going to make it very cold so the gas becomes a liquid, and it's 269 degrees actually, and immense amounts of energy are required to make it that cold. And so you immediately are adding to the already considerable greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas by liquefying it because of all the energy required simply to bring it down to that cold temperature. But here's the real kicker. In order to maintain it at that low temperature, that you have to rely on evaporative cooling. Otherwise, it would simply, as it warmed up, it would simply explode. And so that is accomplished by simply venting methane into the atmosphere. So that hugely adds to the greenhouse gas footprint of all this unburned methane that's simply and deliberately released from LNG tankers. And so the need for us then to build massive export terminals that would then ship this abroad requires a huge, often coal-burning power plants to run, further increasing the footprint. So
let me ask, how about state to state? What is the process of transporting it state to state?
Well, that runs through pipelines.
Okay. It's not, in what form does it take? And what are the dangers associated with that, if any?
Well, when natural gas comes out of the ground, the first thing that has to happen is that, because it's a mixture of all the different gases, right? So what methane, of course, represents is a vaporized corpse of an animal that lived 400 million years ago. And other vaporized corpses turned into other kinds of gases, such as benzene, propane, ethane, butane. So the first thing that happens then, before the gas is put into a pipeline for transport to market, is that those other gases have to be separated off. And those are often released into the environment, and many of them are highly toxic. And then the gas has to be pressurized in order to run through the pipe, and that's the power to do that is provided by a compressor, which also runs on fossil fuel and further adds exhaust and contributes greatly to ground level ozone. And so one of the economic costs of transporting gas through pipelines that's not very well appreciated but needs to be monetized is the inevitable ozone, ground level ozone, namely smog, that accompanies the compression and the distribution of gas to market through pipelines. Ground level smog kills. It kills through stroke, through heart attack risk. It is known to be linked to childhood asthma, and all of those disorders come with high medical costs.
All right. John, next question is for you. What percentage of the fluid that you put into the ground, in other words, fracking in layman's terms involves injecting water, sand, and chemicals into the ground into shale formations, releasing the gas, and then you take the water back out or the fluid back out. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. What percentage of the fluid you put in do you get back out?
It comes back in stages. Predominantly, initially during the flowback stage, it comes out at probably 15 to 20% is the likely recovery in a flowback stage. Then as you go into production, you continue to bring that fluid out, and over the life, we've had wells that you'll recover 100%. In some cases, you don't. In some cases, it becomes colonate water in the reservoir.
But that water itself, or that fluid, is toxic, is it not?
I don't consider it toxic. I mean, we handle it. In most cases, we were required to analyze what it is and then develop a plan to dispose of it.
And your plan to dispose of it includes recycling it at times, correct?
In most cases, the initial flowback is recycled so that we minimize the additional need of fresh water. We use flowback water.
But if you're leaving 85% in each time, initially. And what you take out, you recycle. The water that or the fluid that comes back up out of the ground brings with it naturally occurring radioactive materials such as radium, uranium, and radon, correct? Back up through it.
Mm-hmm.
So is it fair to say that, and you're adding additional chemicals each time you put that recycled fluid back in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it fair to say that each time you use that recycled fluid, you are dramatically increasing the toxicity of what's going into the water or going into the ground?
No, in most cases in the recycling process, you're taking out a lot of the materials and you're disposing. The primary method for disposal now is underground disposal. It's been utilized in the United States since the early 70s, and it's regulated by the EPA UIC program. So in the best practices of the industry, beyond the recycling, when you get to the materials that can't be recycled, we're putting it back under the ground, okay, back in the formation it came from in most cases.
But the formation it came from, when you're not putting back what was there in the beginning, you're putting into that formation recycled fluid, which includes all the chemicals and the sand and the naturally occurring radioactive elements that come out with it, right?
A lot of the chemicals you utilize in the stimulation treatment are developed to perform certain functions, whether it's to coat the pipe so you don't have corrosion, or it's to basically mix with the water to create an easier flow parameter to get the fluid out. So a lot of the chemicals are basically broken down. They break themselves down, become, in essence, some of the materials, and as we go into a greener environment and we use best management practices, a lot of the chemicals are what we would call biodegradable. So they're basically breaking down to the point where there's no impact.
Are you saying that the fluid you put into the ground will, on its own, take care of itself? It's biodegradable, and that it will, over time, become something that isn't dangerous to the water table or anything else? Are you saying that over time, what you put into the ground, what you dispose of, will essentially fix itself?
Essentially, it'll stay there. Because what's left in the ground will stay in the ground, never to be seen by the light of earth. But that's part of the practice. In oil and gas development, oil and gas and water essentially reside in the reservoir together. That water typically contains the materials that are natural to the reservoir rock that it produces out of. In some cases, the deeper rocks like the shales, you get a lot of saline, you get a lot of the heavier salts, you get some of the heavier metals, you get some radioactive material. But all of those things are natural to the reservoir. So if they stay there, they're never to come back up.
I'll get back to that in just a second. Next question for Sandra. New Yorkers consume an enormous amount of natural gas already, but New York produces less than 10% of what New Yorkers consume. So in order to get it here, it has to be transported. Now, you've already discussed the dangers of transporting it from New York to another state. Having made that argument, isn't it possible that the benefit of not having to import it from another state into New York would outweigh the environmental damage caused by hydrofracking?
Well, pipelines, whether they run within a state or cross an imaginary line between Pennsylvania and New York, carry with them the same dangers. And so the way to approach this, I think, is to always ask, what other alternatives do we have? And in fact, we have many. And one of them is to actually stop wasting energy and decrease our energy consumption so that we don't need to build more new pipelines, whether they cross and bring us fracked gas from Pennsylvania, or we decide to frack ourselves and build pipelines within New York. And bringing down the need to energy, the need for energy is the path to energy independence, and it also provides good local jobs. And this The country really leading the way on this is Germany, which has decreased its energy consumption by 30%, providing 200,000 jobs in the process by retrofitting their housing stock and their public buildings, which are considerably older than ours are, and also then decreasing carbon emissions. So in my mind, that's a more rational approach to the need that New York has for energy, rather than build new pipelines and feed our insatiable demand for more natural gas. Instead, invest in efficiency measures, which is a far better job creations program and provides jobs that don't kill people and blow people up and expose them to silica dust, because the kind of jobs that fracking provides are the kinds of jobs that have high on-the-job fatality rates. According to our Centers for Disease Control, they have fatality rates 7 times that of other industries. And of course, most recently, we saw the inferno at a wellhead in Bobtown, Pennsylvania, that killed 29-year-old Ian McKee. And a new study out from a year-long investigation by the Houston Chronicle of worker deaths in Texas demonstrates that grievous injuries as well as death is common, including crushing, burns, and lost limbs, and that the OSHA, our Occupational Health and Safety Administration, has not been following this closely enough. By contrast, investing in efficiency measures to bring down our need for natural gas would provide the kind of jobs that a mom might want to send her son off to get, not the kind that make us afraid as parents.
But isn't that a problem with OSHA?
Well, it's
rather than a problem with the, the entire concept of hydrofracking?
Well, these are jobs that are inherently dangerous. We're talking about dealing with inherently explosive and flammable chemicals. And we're talking about exposure of workers to chemicals at the well's head for which there is no mitigating solution. For example, silica dust. So when we talk about fracking, we spend a lot of time talking about water as the agent of fracking. But in fact, and John mentioned this too, that the water itself contains sand, and it contains a particular kind of sand called silica sand, which is very spherical and very strong. Silica sand can withstand the lithostatic pressure of the earth, and so it's used to, the water as a kind of fire hose of pressure injects, breaks the rock apart, but also injects these grains of silica sand into the cracks so created.
30 seconds.
And they become little door stops holding the stony doors ajar so the gas can flow out. However, tiny dust particles of silica are like asbestos. They are a known cause of lung cancer and a known cause of silicosis, which is a disabling illness. So our National Institutes for Occupational Health and Safety have warned that workers on the job site cannot protect themselves sufficiently from silica dust through wearing masks and so forth. So high is the concentration of dust at the workplace.
All right. I want to, for John Holko, I want to get an idea of something people can visualize here, and I want to understand this as clearly as possible. I've heard figures of 1.7 million gallons per cycle needed to operate a well. Is that close?
1.7, you mean to hydraulically fracture a well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How many times can one well be run in a year?
Once.
You're saying each well will be run or operated only once per year?
You mean hydraulically fracture?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They're essentially the hydraulic fracturing treatment is a stage in the development of the well. Once the well is hydraulically fractured, it goes to the next stage, which is cleaning that up, and then it goes into the production stage. So that essentially is in a fairly short period of time, and it doesn't occur more than once a year.
So the impact of each well on water, or the requirements of each well with respect to water, are 1.7 million gallons total.
Well, and it depends. There are, in hydraulic fracturing operations now with the development of horizontal wells in multiple stages, it depends on how many stages in that individual well bore. It's an economy of scale. As the industry has grown and we're able to drill longer laterals, we can put more stages in one well, increasing the impact of the water on that one well, probably increasing it beyond that 1 million gallons or 2 million gallons.
How far beyond?
You could have wells now that are 8,000 to 10,000 foot laterals using 5 million gallons of water for an individual lateral. But that may be one well that takes the place of 4 wells.
And how many wells does the industry envision constructing in New York?
There's projections, and these, you know, come everywhere from the DEC's review and the SGEIS of 50 to 100,000 wells. The likelihood of that happening all depends on the resource that's here and the ability to develop it and what we can do.
Where are you going to get up to 5 million gallons for 50 to 100,000 wells?
Basically, predominantly from surface waters. And also what we've gone to using is secondary water sources like gray water sources, and in Pennsylvania we use the residual runoffs from coal mines that are basically unusable for other things. We've been able to convert the chemistry in our hydraulic fracturing treatments to use water that otherwise isn't usable. What we've done here in New York is we've done taking gray water from the discharge sides of various water treatment facilities and used that as an impetus to put in the wells to minimize the use of fresh water.
Has Pennsylvania reached a point where they are running out of water?
No.
Pennsylvania right now has gas company in Pennsylvania has a contract to import up to 1 million gallons of water per day from the town of Painted Post, New York.
Mm-hmm.
Why would they need to do that?
Because it's easier sourcing it. What you have to do, and this is, if you go back and review the SGEIS and review the proposals and regulations in Pennsylvania, what both states are requiring is a development of a water use plan. A lot of towns, like Painted Post and other areas, have excess water capacity. That's a resource to them, that's a value to them, and it lowers the tax base to the community. And what the oil and gas company has done is they've gone to some of these communities who have excess water on their off-use line, and they basically say, can we purchase it from you? And it allows the towns to lower their property taxes. It allows the towns to get a revenue stream from the industry. So that's why those kind of things happen. It's not because there's no other place to get it. What the industry is looking at is a development of water sources that are actually positive, not just for the industry, but for the communities around where they operate.
Sandra Steingraber, 10 days ago, and I mentioned this study in a question to John Holko. The journal Science published a study conducted, as I said, by scientists at Stanford University, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the United States Department of Energy, that concluded, among other things, that switching from coal-fired power plants to natural gas-fired power plants will still lower planet warming emissions overall. Do you agree with that?
I do, in the context in which the statement was made, which is to say that over a 100-year period, it is less bad than coal. And that seems to be a true statement, although, and there may be fellow scientists in the room who disagree with me. I think a lot of that statement
that takes into consideration the methane that is released.
Yeah.
Okay.
But here's the kick. Here's the problem. We don't have 100 years to solve the climate crisis. The best science tells us that we can't exceed 2 degrees Celsius in warming before we hit catastrophic tipping points. And by that, we're talking about collapsing the plankton stocks, which provide us half the oxygen we breathe. We're talking about making agriculture impossible because pollination won't work anymore and so forth. So we don't want to get to that point. And where are we on that trajectory? Well, we don't have 100 years to solve that problem. We have maybe 10 to 20 years. So when you look at that in that time frame, it's a wash. In other words, natural gas, which has a potency that's much higher than carbon dioxide, but whose longevity is shorter. On a shorter time scale, it's very clear that natural gas is a disaster for the climate. And therefore, telling ourselves that we have a whole century to sort this out is really delusional.
Okay. John Holko, I want to talk to you about compulsory integration orders. Under New York State law, specifically Section 23901 of the New York State Environmental Law, landowners who do not want their property mined for gas can be forced to allow it if 60% of surrounding landowners or leaseholders want it. Is that your understanding of the law as well?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that infringes on the rights of landowners who don't approve of fracking?
It was developed under the state's requirement to protect correlative rights. And what it was developed for, and when you read the statute and understand the drilling process, there will be no well bore under that land. There will be no well on that land. What the state is protecting from and the sort of the integration protects of is if there's gas migrating from that land into the wellbore, which is on adjacent property, they want that landowner compensated. So the law was designed as a correlative rights compensation tool by the state. Does it infringe on anything? No, because there's no physical activity on that property.
Well, wasn't that law in fact designed for oil and gas that was migrating and not, blasted from shale? I mean, the whole concept behind fracking is that gas isn't going anywhere until there's a well drilled and then pointed horizontally, and then at the point where that shale is fractured and that gas is released, the gas is then recoverable. I mean, wasn't that law intended for things for gas and oil that were migrating freely rather than things you essentially have to go and get?
Not necessarily. It was designed to protect any sort of migration and to be able to know exactly where the gas is coming from. Gas in a shale, gas in a sandstone, gas in a limestone reservoir that's basically faulted or fractured, all migrates from some point. The shales are just very, very tight formations, so they have very low porosity, very low permeability. The idea of the horizontal drilling and the hydraulic fracturing is contact area. We create a larger space that the stuff moves into. So when you have that larger space, you can draw from distances. The idea of how far it draws from is a matter of time. What happens is if a wellbore is drilled and you have a long, long period of time, gas will migrate from long distances.
How do you know where you've taken it from?
Basically, in our business, it can be analyzed after the fact. You can do a lot of analysis on pressure relationships and production volumes and decline curve plotting to analyze where it comes from.
I just want to make sure I understand this. You're saying that you can go onto the land of somebody who is not allowed fracking and somehow determine whether or not gas underneath their property has been extracted.
Well, that's the problem. You don't really know it came from there. What we can do is estimate the distance from which it came. Now you're dealing in a three-dimensional environment where you have distances this way and this way.
And how do you know how much to compensate them?
Well, that's why it's compensated based on the law. That's why the law was created, to create a fair mechanism where the people around that if you have a landowner who doesn't want it, it's not fair for them to stop those others who do.
Why not?
Well, there's a mechanism if they don't want it. What they can do is they could basically go to their neighbors and buy those rights. They never have to develop them. They could basically say, I'll take them.
They don't have the right on their own land to say, I don't want fracking to be conducted on my land.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I actually have read the law, and the compensation speaks to proportional share.
Right.
How do you determine the proportion if you don't know how much is coming from their land?
Because the units are designed by a minimum spacing from the wellbore. In New York State, you have 330 feet. That minimum space, okay, is what the state and the legislature and engineers over time have basically said that's what you can naturally draw to that wellbore, that distance. It's, you know, after wells are produced for long periods of time, you can go in and those can be quantified. But in the beginning, to compensate those all around, you have to have some sort of mechanical means. That mechanical means is the law.
It's almost 10 of 8, or it's actually almost 5 of 8. So we're going to go one more question for each. This is, I guess, what you would call an environmental justice question. Very few people, pro or con fracking, who have lived in New York, would ever describe it as anything other than highly regulatory. You know, just living here. If New York, relative to other parts of the nation, high income, high regulation state, bans fracking, won't that just push it to other lower income, lower regulated states, such as West Virginia? And isn't there almost an environmental justice question at play there? Aren't those people going to be affected? I mean, we have 30 states plus doing this now. Nobody's stopping. Where it goes next, and West Virginia could do it, it is unlikely, given their history, that they are going to regulate it nearly as harshly as New York regulates every last thing I do. So, isn't that worth considering?
Well, I guess I disagree with the premise of the question because it presumes that somehow the amount of demand for natural gas must be fixed. So if we close our doors here, we're simply pushing it somewhere else. The scenario that I foresee is this one, that we in New York become a showplace for renewable energy, and we reinvent a global economy and show the world what we can do right here, and make the Southern Tier the heart of that. We have already a blueprint for such a project given to us by economists and scientists from Stanford and Cornell, published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it's called the Solutions Project, and you can simply Google that and read all about it. The Solution Project has no room for natural gas, and in fact shows us how we could entirely convert New York State's energy infrastructure to entirely off of fossil fuel, leaving it in the ground, and do what we know the whole world needs to do, which is to make the leap into wind, water, and solar power, and we could do it by mid-century. And should we do that, the kind of jobs that we would provide, the kind of innovations that we could do with rooftop solar and offshore wind would actually become an example to the rest of the nation and the world. I think it could be transformational.
But aren't you talking then about means of producing electricity?
Means of producing electricity, but this plan also includes transportation as well.
What about the 50,000 gas ovens, furnaces, and dryers in Broome County? But what happens even assuming that scenario went forward? Who pays for that? How does everybody convert over to those things? I mean, as I prepared for this debate, the entire conversation seems to be about how best to produce electricity and how best to fuel vehicles. But isn't there a whole other side of this that really affects, average people? They would have to go out and somehow convert to something that could be, I don't know, powered by solar or wind to heat their home and dry their clothes and cook their meals. And how are they going to do that?
Yeah, the details of that plan all can read at the Solutions Project, and there are very technical and compelling answers to all those things. But I guess I would like to use the time to say, that task is at hand. It is our generation now who has to make this leap into renewable energy. The fate of the entire planet and our children's lives depend on it. Our children need a world in which there are pollinators. We need a world in which there is a jet stream that keeps the Arctic in the Arctic and not blowing vortexes all over us. And that is only going to be possible when we do the very hard work that's exactly what you're describing. As the adult in the room, I feel that it is, I just happen to have been born in the generation whose task this is. I would prefer to do that rather than kick the can down the road and have my children have to grow up and make that leap when the world is far more chaotic because of climate destruction, and their task is made far more difficult. And in thinking back historically, I think that we have many models to inspire us. There was a time in our nation's history when it was thought to be absolutely unrealistic to divorce our economy from its dependence on slave labor. And even in a free state of Illinois, which is where I grew up, it was thought to be unthinkable. We could be a free state, but we needed Missouri to not be, right? But we had to figure out ways of doing that. And we took a regulatory approach at first, right? Missouri was the slave state, Maine was going to be the free state. We tried to have all these regulations that were brought to us by the Supreme Court, but in the end, it was abolition and prohibition and redesigning our entire economy that was the task that had to be done. And we have an equally large and momentous task, but I think it's doable, and I think it's doable without having to tear ourselves apart over it. I am a great believer in engineering and ingenuity and green chemistry and our ability to figure this out. By contrast, nobody does doom and gloom like the oil and gas industry, insisting to us that we have no other choice but to keep poisoning ourselves and killing the planet.
Well, I don't know if we can necessarily, fairly compare an honest debate about whether or not to hydraulically frack gas to slavery. But I just want to know if you believe that, over what period of time do you believe it would take for even the political will in New York State to arrive at a place where they'd be willing to pursue a completely renewable energy policy?
Well, I think that moment is at hand. I truly believe that.
That you believe that the legislature and the governor right now are of that frame of mind, to abandon natural gas, coal in New York in favor of solar and wind?
I believe that there are a tipping point of people who see that as not only our future, but who are eager to move as quickly as we can and turn this place into a showcase for renewable energy and leap right into that as quickly as possible. That's what I see. And I think it's hard looking forward because it's new to us, but looking backward, I think it's easier. Slavery is one example. A more mundane example might be what New York State chose to do with smoking. Right? I mean, we take a regulatory approach to, for example, drinking in public. We feel that the risks and benefits of someone drinking in public, as long as they don't get in their car and have a certain blood alcohol level, we regulate that. But smoking in public, New York State finally took a different tact, realizing that it was inherently dangerous. There was no way to safely smoke in public and not contaminate someone else.
30 seconds.
And so just in the same way that when I grew up, smoking was glamorous and we couldn't imagine actually not smoking in airplanes, now my children don't understand why anyone smokes. It seems grotesque to them. So we've made this cultural leap because of something that started off with scientists working hand in glove with anti-smoking activists, eventually compelling and convincing legislators. So now we see scientists working hand in glove with anti-fracking activists with an alternative vision, banning fracking, embracing renewables that we will be bringing before our elected officials, and I think we're certainly making headway on that.
All right, last question for John Holko. Is it accurate to say that the industry is not promising that all of the gas drilled in New York would stay in New York?
I think the industry would promise that all of New York's gas needs will be met, and that if there's excess supplies and the economics weigh in the favor of doing something else with it, it'll be exported to other places, whether it's another state or another country.
So you're saying that the industry is committing to, regardless if there is a higher price somewhere else, it would make it worthwhile to sell it elsewhere the industry would meet all of New York's needs first before it considered selling it elsewhere.
Oh, I think it always does.
But you're saying that. I just want to be clear about that. That's a commitment that you're making on behalf of the industry. They would sell it in New York first till that need was met.
Well,
and only then consider selling it elsewhere.
I think what you're referring to is New York's gas.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then now you have the whole economics of federal laws that provide freedom of selling wherever the market bears. So
Absolutely.
You can't.
And you have an obligation to do that on behalf of the industry?
Absolutely. I mean, the obligation is if the value to New York of something is more valuable if it's sold in Pennsylvania, New York will receive more for it. If we can take our grapes and sell our wine in Pennsylvania and make more money, New York supports the idea of, we can bring wine into New York from California, from Italy, from wherever.
But we're not talking about a New York company.
But it's
we're
the same
talking about
example.
a resource taken from New York and all the dangers that may or may not come with it, and it being sold out. You're not promising that all of the gas that is drilled in New York will be sold in New York. It could be sold, and it should be sold in a business environment where you get the most money for it.
It will be sold wherever the economics prevail.
Okay.
The general understanding is you have to realize that the best place to sell a commodity like natural gas, because once you start to move it, you minimize the value at the wellhead. And the operator wants to maximize their wellhead value. So the closer the market is to that wellhead, the more value it will have. As Sandra said,
depending on what the consumer is paying.
Absolutely, but believe me, that world market of natural gas, like the world market of oil, is fixed by the world market. We pay the same here that they do other places. In reality, what happens is the actual cost to us is less because as we produce more resources in the United States, we increase the value. We improve security, we improve other things. Those are the additional value you get from it.
I just want to clarify, in case New Yorkers are under the impression that the gas taken from underneath the ground in New York will be sold in New York. That is not a commitment that the energy industry is making.
I don't think it would be.
Okay. Actually, I have one more question for you, just about, and this litigation is going on all over the country. Do you believe that the public should be able to learn the chemical makeup of the fluid you use for fracking?
Yeah, in New York State, according to the SGEIS,
and could you explain that phrase?
The SGEIS is the current guidelines for the industry. It's the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. It's the whole thing that started this whole deciphering process. And the way it works currently is, in the SGEIS, the DEC will receive all the information on all the chemicals. If you have a proprietary mixture, that can be kept secret from general population unless and if, and by law, if something happens, unlike what Sandra says, there's no way to keep it out of the courtrooms. If something happens and there's a chemical constituent that's needed, it will be recovered. The DEC has the obligation to answer those questions.
But if I have a well on my land and I don't know what the chemicals are, I don't know what to look for as far as health effects to me. Right?
The DEC in that SGEIS and in their regulatory process has designed testing programs, and we're required to do pre-test, during test, and post-test that basically provide the analysis necessary for the landowner and the regulatory agencies to understand what's there.
All right. With that, I want to thank the debaters, and I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to stress what I hope I got across at the beginning, which I may or may not. I don't believe there's any such thing as an evil industry, and I don't believe there's any such thing as going too far in terms of environmental concern. These are two people who believe very different things, but they believe them. And it's for that reason that they're here, and I appreciate the respect this crowd showed to this debate tonight. I don't know what will happen with hydrofracking in New York, but I hope tonight you got to hear or feel that you got to hear from passionate people who believe what they are talking about, give you their best arguments. Thank you.